I search for God, but keep clear of miracles. Friends who believe in God feel a little sorry for me. They exhort me to accept that miracles are real, to find miracles in my own life, to recognize that miracles demonstrate, if not prove, the existence of a supernatural being. I resist. Maybe it's my scientific training, maybe it's my lack of faith. As much as I want to believe in God, I refuse to argue for God from miracles. Am I wrong? I'm Robert Lawrence Kuhn, and Closer to Truth is my journey to find out. I should begin with God's providence, God's overarching ultimate care for God's creation, the claimed source and motivation of miracles. Then I'll push for how miracles might work. I ask the well-known Christian apologist and debater, William Lane Craig. Bill is a good philosopher who defends traditional doctrines. Bill, the concept of God's involvement in the world, this idea of God's providence, how does that relate to God as the creator?
I think that it means that God is involved in everything that happens in the world, and we can distinguish within God's providence or control of the world and what we might call his extraordinary providence. His ordinary providence would be his governance of the world through the instrumentality of natural causes. And then his extraordinary providence would be God's bringing about events which lie beyond the productive capacity of natural causes. And these we would call miracles.
And you believe in those?
Yes, I think that it's very clear that if you have the concept of a being who is the creator and designer of the universe, and who has therefore decided which natural laws govern the world, that they lie within his power, and that therefore such a transcendent being could easily produce events in the natural world which lie beyond the capacity of natural causes.
Does that mean there was an imperfection in how God designed the natural law if he has to intervene to change that natural law?
A miracle shouldn't be conceived as breaking the natural law. That is, I think, an improper concept of natural law, and it's psychologically prejudicial as well. It connotes a sort of divine rape of Mother Nature, akin to violating a civil law, to say a miracle is a violation of the natural laws.
How do you define it?
I would say a miracle is an event that occurs which is beyond the productive capacity of the natural causes at that time and place.
Sounds like you're a good lawyer saying the same thing.
No, it's not, because I'm not saying he breaks the natural laws. The natural laws hold, but God is able to produce events which the natural causes themselves don't have the capacity to bring about. Miracles are not meant to be adjustments to the natural world, to rectify imperfections. Rather, miracles are meant to be revelatory in that they are extraordinary events that point beyond the natural world to its ground in a supernatural creator.
How come I haven't seen any?
Well, maybe you haven't been looking in the right places. I do think
I've
that
come
God,
to you.
All right, I think that God still is about the business of doing miracles today, but
Just doesn't care about me.
well, no, he cares about you. I mean, this is getting to a very personal level. I do think that God can do miracles today in people's lives, but I also think that God can be operative in your life and answer your prayers without having to bring about miracles through his ordinary providence. And the key here is to remember that God, as an omniscient being, would know what any free person would freely do in any set of circumstances that he created them in, so that God can arrange for things to happen in the world without any kind of miraculous intervention whatsoever.
What I find interesting is the concept of God as creator has a multiplicity of different expressions.
It's more than just bringing things into existence. It's the initial act of creation of the world out of nothing. It's concurring with the actions of secondary agents to produce their effects. It is his ordinary providence through his omniscience of governing the world of creatures to achieve his ultimate ends. And then it is his miraculous operations in the world beyond the natural capacity of spatiotemporal causes.
Sounds like a full-time job to me.
Yes, though for an omnipotent being, it's not something he can't discharge effectively.
God as creator, sustainer, providence provider, and miracle maker. I'd like to believe all of this, of course. Who wouldn't? I follow Bill's logic. If there exists a transcendent being who designed and created the universe, making miracles would be easy work. Fair enough. But hold on. To assume that God exists in order to sustain belief in miracles suggests circular reasoning. Also, maybe such a being would not circumvent its own laws. Here's the thing. Miracles are violations of physical laws. By definition, miracles are physical events, which means that miracles must produce physical evidence. So where's the evidence? Before I succumb, I'd better check in with a skeptic. Walter Sinnott-Armstrong, a law professor at Dartmouth, is not ambivalent in his atheism. Walter has debated Bill Craig. He probably does better than I. But can he help me?
Miracles are normally things that are reported by one person or several people, sometimes even a large crowd. And you have to assess whether the miracle itself, which is always something surprising that seems to go against the normal course of nature, whether it's so surprising that the evidence against its happening is stronger than the evidence against these people just making a mistake. So if a group of people say, "Whoa, did you see that? Last week I saw George Bush walk on water. And then when he got to the other side, he stood up and he walked above the water," right? Now, what are you going to say about this? You can say, well, it's possible. Of course, it's contrary to the laws of nature, but it's logically possible. Are we going to believe the people who report this? I say, no, you never have adequate reason to believe the people who report these miracles. One reason is, of course, who do you think would report that George Bush walks on water? They're all Republicans, right? And who do you think reports these miracles that they witness? Well, they're Christian believers. And so it's not surprising that a group of people would be telling stories like this, and they might even honestly believe them because they're interpreting things they did experience as being miracles. I don't know of any cases where the evidence for the miracle isn't outweighed by the evidence of the laws of nature, because that's a lot of evidence against it.
So really what you're doing is you're setting a high barrier, and the more incredible the occurrence, right, the higher that standard has to be.
Sure. Take the resurrection of Jesus, right? The grave is empty, and the three women saw the grave was empty. Well, maybe it was empty, but does that mean he rose into heaven? No, maybe the grave wasn't empty, but they went back and reported that. Why would they do that? Well, it gets them a little standing in the community after all. And then, where does Jesus appear? He appears to his disciples. Well, I'd appear to my disciples too, because they're going to report it that way. It's very possible that this person says, "Look over there, I see Jesus." And the others don't want to say, "No, I don't see him," because then they're not believers. There are all kinds of social pressures to get those kinds of stories going. And even if they're not going at the time, these stories weren't written down till 30, 40, 50, sometimes even as close to 100 years later. And by that time, they've become legends that might have little or no connection to what actually happened.
What do we do with the revelations of the major religions of the world, all of which embed one way or another some kind of miraculous happenings?
So the first thing you have to recognize about those scriptures is that they were written in times when you had to include that kind of thing to be taken seriously. I mean, the books that said, well, he was a nice guy and he had some nice things to say, we don't have those anymore. Those don't survive. They don't start movements. So you have to put in some of that kind of fluff in order to get the book accepted. The second thing you should recognize about those books is they're all good books that have lots of wisdom and wise things that I would agree with in them, especially moral teachings and some historical accuracy, sure. Just don't buy it word for word.
Extraordinary events demand extraordinary evidence. That's the skeptic's rule for assessing miracles. And that makes sense. After all, if miracles plays its game on the field of physical law, it must abide by scientific rules to make its case. Now, given what we know about miracles, that at best they do not convince everyone, how significant are miracles in arguing that God exists? I go to Washington to meet Oxford's Richard Swinburne, a renowned philosopher who argues for the existence of God. Richard is rigorous in his analytical arguments. So how does he handle miracles? Richard, the argument for God, for miracles, is not looked upon very favorably among a large number of scientists, scholars in today's world. How do you see that argument contemporarily?
Well, I think it's only part of a cumulative case. One has to have other reasons as well for believing in God. But given that, arguments from miracles can top up the case, can increase the case. There can be good evidence for a miracle. The evidence will simply consist in showing of a certain event that if it occurred, it would be clearly a violation of natural laws. So when anybody suggests a miracle has occurred, there is a conflict. There is a conflict between evidence of what happens on innumerable other occasions supporting such and such being a law of nature, and the evidence mainly of testimony that on this occasion things happen differently. So how are you to weigh them against each other? I can see there could be evidence of testimony and evidence that these sort of witnesses were totally reliable witnesses, and there were lots of them, and they wrote down exactly what happened after the event and so on. So I don't think in principle evidence from what always happens should always by itself outweigh the evidence of testimony, but we should dictate how we regard testimony in the light of our background knowledge of how the world works. If we have even wider background evidence, e.g. background evidence suggesting that there is a God, and we ought to bring that in as well as the fact of laws of nature. So if you have reason already to believe that it's quite probable there's a God, then it's a serious possibility that the laws of nature operate only insofar as he chooses they should. Then if you can show this is the sort of event he might have brought about if there is a God, you only need a certain amount of testimony to show that it has occurred, because the background evidence is not uniform background evidence saying this always occurs, but is background evidence suggesting this occurs because there is a God of the traditional kind, and therefore he will seek to do good acts, and intervening in the laws of nature for certain reasons on a certain occasion might be a good act.
What are those reasons, and why would a God break his own laws?
God would have one of two reasons for bringing about a miracle. The first would be in answer to human prayers for something to happen. Somebody might pray very much for their child to get better from cancer. Now you might say, well, if God thought it a good thing anyway, he would have arranged that they got better from cancer, so what's the point in him answering human prayers? And the answer to that is God wants to interact with humans, and there are states of affairs which there is some reason why God would bring them about, but he wouldn't necessarily bring them about unless asked. He wants our asking to make a difference to what happens. The other reason is to put his signature on some teaching of a prophet, setting aside the laws of nature, is something that God alone can do. So if some prophet proclaims a teaching and God, as it were, forwards that teaching by producing a miracle which forwards that teaching, then that puts his signature on the teaching of the prophet.
Richard, as always, offers rational, thoughtful arguments for God, and I never tire of listening and learning. But among his many arguments for the existence of God, miracles, to me, are not his best. He carefully presents what would count for evidence, but seems frightfully short of specific examples. Understandably so, because, to be kind, there aren't so many. Months later, while visiting Richard at Oxford, I steal off and confer with an atheistic philosopher in the grand Oxfordian tradition, Bede Rundle.
Bede, I'd like to see how you analyze miracles philosophically to justify an existence of God.
Right. Well, we want an episode which is not only extraordinary, but which can't be explained by any natural means. And then the question is, how could you ever be in a position to say of an extraordinary event that it had that standing? Well, you can query the reliability of people who report on a supposed miracle, but that's something that you could overcome if you had sufficiently many witnesses, if you had photographic records and so on. It might be absolutely clear that such and such took place, and also clear that we cannot explain it. The difficulty is in knowing when you can justifiably say there is no natural explanation. Think, for example, of those terribly clever people who have these shows where, let's say, they can tell somebody what is in an envelope, you get somebody to draw something in another room, and they can tell you what that drawing was, and so on. Well, usually these people are able to explain just what they're doing.
It's a trick.
It's a trick, yeah. And in cases where they can't, it would be very interesting, because you might say, well, perhaps there's such a thing as telepathy. But again, that is keeping you in the physical world. It's just, it would seem to show that human beings had powers that they hadn't recognized, and there's something to investigate. But to take the step of postulating divine intervention, that is something which you would, as far as I can see, never have sufficient evidence to do.
Well, so you're looking at really three levels here. One, for any miracle, is it just a trick? Second level, if even it's real, is that there's a higher explanation resident within the physical world for this extraordinary event that we just don't know.
Yeah.
Let's go to the third step. What you're saying is it's impossible? No matter how miraculous a situation is, you can't go from that to an inference to a God or a supernatural being.
The question would be, could you regard supernatural intervention as a genuine explanation, even if one that could be appealed to only in the last resort?
Last resort.
Because that's what people may say. It's only rational to leave room for that explanation when all else fails us.
Yes.
Now, my query would be, can you really speak of this as an explanation when you don't have the faintest idea of how this being acts, how it's able to do what it does? You really are just saying something no better than, I'm afraid it's inexplicable as far as we can tell. And maybe that's the case. Maybe there are certain things that happen from time to time for which there is no explanation.
But as an explanation of last resort, what you're saying is you'd rather have some brute fact that there is no explanation rather than to be able to infer that there is a God who did that miracle.
Yes, because I don't think that is an explanation. Not everything will earn the title of explanation, and I think the theistic hypothesis doesn't meet the demands.
Bede's point is that no matter what the apparent miracle, the existence of God would never follow. Always there could be other explanations. Bede does not believe in God. As for me, even if I would believe in God, I would still agree with Bede on miracles. Do I miss something? Maybe I should break away from philosophy's grip. Since miracles need to be assessed scientifically, I meet a scientist who is a believer. And not just any scientist, but one of the best. Francis Collins, renowned for his leadership of the Human Genome Project, is the director of the National Institutes of Health. Francis is the author of The Language of God, which claims to offer evidence for belief. I have to tell you, Francis, that the subject of miracles was something I really didn't want to cover. I don't know why. Maybe it's my scientific background. I just felt uncomfortable with it. I shared this with some very sophisticated colleagues in philosophy and theology, and they insisted that to really explore the depth, I needed to cover it. So I want to come to you as a leading scientist to talk about miracles.
Well, I think we should. When I talk to other scientists about the fact that I am a believer, almost always one of the questions that comes up fairly quickly is, well, that's fine, but you don't believe in miracles, do you? And when I answer, well, yes, on occasion, I think that's possible, there's usually a sort of gasp of amazement, because that seems like such a violation of the scientific approach. I mean, a miracle, by definition, is a violation of the natural laws that you cannot explain by any other interpretation. Now, we have to be careful here, because miracles are thrown about a bit too freely in discourse these days, and sometimes by people who really believe that, oh, it's a miracle, I found that parking space, or it's a miracle, look at that flower blooming and how beautiful it is. Well, no, I can tell you what genes got turned on in order for that pigment to appear in just that color. That's not a miracle. But are there things that really do represent a suspension of the laws of nature? Certainly many belief systems require that. For me as a Christian, the resurrection of Christ in a literal sense is a very central part of my beliefs. How can I possibly agree to something like that completely violates all the laws of biology? And I mean, what happened to the DNA and the cellular organelles in order to make that possible? I don't see this actually as a big of a logical problem as it's portrayed to be. The big question is, do you believe in God? And as a component of that, do you believe in a God who is at least in part outside of nature? And then do you believe in a God who is still active in modern times? If you're willing to say yes, yes, and yes, then the idea that
it's a short jump to miracles.
It's a very short jump. In fact, it's almost a disappointment if you don't take that jump. If God is active, why wouldn't he at times choose to send us a message by suspending laws in a way that was supposed to convey something really important?
If you look at the reported miracles in major religions, they are very heavily skewed to long time ago, when there are questionable historical records, and as you bring them more current and you look at any claims, they all fall apart.
I agree. There's certainly a question here about how much veracity can be attached to things that were described that happened a long time ago when there were no scientific instruments present at the time. Certainly, you could make the counter-argument, though, that miracles don't happen randomly. If God is at some purpose by allowing or causing such miracles to occur, it is because he's trying to send a message. And perhaps there were times during the course of history where those messages were particularly needed, and therefore that's when they happened. And if we weren't living at one of those ganglions of history, that we shouldn't expect, therefore, to see miracles happening around us at the moment.
I would certainly think today is a ganglion of history, but maybe everybody feels that way in every era.
Right, exactly, by definition. Our tendency is always to assume that our time is the most important.
If the Judeo-Christian God really exists, God is personal, and miracles do occur. I deeply want to believe in the Judeo-Christian God, but as for miracles, sadly, I have no confidence and pay no attention. I find claims of ancient miracles, which festoon almost every religion, remote and unpersuasive, and often contradictory. I find claims of modern miracles utterly unappealing, whether preached from pulpits on manipulative television shows or voiced from hearts of sincere believers. Stories of miracles I find spurious or spacious. At best, such miracles are unconvincing. At worst, they blaspheme the very God believers assume they're serving, because they attribute to God things that are false. I fear being arrogant or hard-hearted, and I dread putting God to my infantile tests. But what I anyway feel is this: if God wants me to believe in miracles, it's up to God to figure out how. Few will agree that I'm closer to truth.
For complete interviews and for further information, please visit closertotruth.com.